Welcome back. Let's continue from our last video. Below deck, a scene of utter chaos unfolded with food scattered across the floor and students scrambling over it in a panic. Amidst the frantic assault on the ship, Leo calmly instructed Celia to remain composed. Simultaneously, he drew his sword and expertly severed one of the Kraken's massive tentacles. Celia also drew her own sword, responding sharply that he should concern himself with his own safety. The monster's yellow eyes glared at her, and it retaliated by spraying a torrent of seawater in her direction, causing her to cry out Leo's name. Leo, evidently accustomed to such encounters, remarked that it was a natural reaction for a Kraken, explaining that they sprayed water in response to heat and that it was considered basic knowledge. Celia, thoroughly drenched, glared back at Leo with visible anger. While Leo and Celia were engaged, a student was suddenly ensnared by the monster, a tentacle wrapping around him and lifting him upside down over the sea. The terrified student cried out against the creature. Witnessing the student in peril, both Leo and Celia immediately moved to help. Celia slashed at the monster's tentacle, causing the student to drop. Leo was equally decisive, calmly striking at the Kraken's main body. The tentacle Leo had severed landed directly in front of Carr as he emerged from under a table. Carr looked surprised, acknowledging Celia's skill as the top scorer but questioning Leo's unexpected proficiency. As he pondered this, another frozen tentacle fell near him, momentarily freezing Carr in place. He quickly recovered, standing up angrily and shouting for whoever was above to watch where they were casting things. Above him was the bespectacled girl Leo had encountered in town. Leo recognized her and recalled their previous meeting. At that moment, Chloe Mueller was using her ice magic to attack the monster. Chloe Mueller glanced coldly below and commented that if someone couldn't protect themselves, perhaps they should step back. Despite the sharp words, Carr Thomas didn't seem particularly angry, merely sighing and observing that the strong often paid little heed to those caught in the crossfire of their battles. As if to underscore his point, another tentacle fell near him, causing Carr to retreat fearfully. This time, the two individuals who had appeared were the Llewellyn siblings. Abad, seeing the widespread danger, moved away, stating that the competition was far from over. Celia Zerdinger, within earshot, angrily retorted that the feeling was mutual. Only Chelsea looked back towards Leo, and noticing her gaze, Leo also looked in her direction. Meanwhile, Professor Ein calmly poured himself another glass of wine, observing that there were many monsters in the lake leading to Lumene Academy, specifically mentioning the Kraken. He then looked at the monster, describing it as a perfect welcome party. Professor Ein watched the students fighting with intense effort and frowned slightly, thinking that, as expected, the standout leaders were beginning to emerge. He noted Chen Xia from the east, the rival pair of Celia Zerdinger and Abad Llewellyn from the west, Chloe Mueller from the north, Walden Tiden, the tan-skinned, white-haired youth from the south, and finally, Duran Moira from the central. Observing him working with 6 or 7 other students to fight the Kraken. Professor Ein remarked to himself that this year's recruits were excellent. He lifted his glass and took another sip. When he lowered his glass, Professor Ein's eyebrows furrowed slightly as he considered the one who had impressed him the most. Recalling the image of Leo wielding his sword decisively and remaining utterly calm against the monster, Professor Ein mused about the unknown recruit. He thought Leo's swordsmanship lacked wasted movements and that he moved as if he could predict the Kraken's actions. Suddenly, a knowing smile touched his lips, and he thought with deep meaning that he would soon meet Leo for the night course. The ship finally reached the dock below. Some students lay on the ground, soaked and disheveled. Carr Thomas, feeling dizzy, commented that he hadn't expected to use up all the elixirs he had brought from the deck. Professor Ein jumped down lightly and remarked that since they would have to cross this chaotic lake, it was best for them to quickly become accustomed to it. Upon reaching the school grounds, Professor Ein guided the students, instructing them to move towards the main hall at Lumene Academy. At the training field designated for electives, some quiet discussions were taking place. One person commented that they had predicted there wouldn't be any normal students, expressing hope for some interesting individuals this year. An announcement came over the loudspeaker, indicating that the entrance ceremony was about to begin. Professor Ein had organized the outstanding students of the year into rows. In front of them, he clapped his hands and instructed them to line up by region, with the top scorers standing at the head of each row. The announcement rang out again, stating that the headmaster would deliver a speech. The person who stepped forward was a dignified old man named Kallian Badian, a swordsman and the headmaster of Lumene Academy. He began his speech, welcoming the new blood who had arrived hoping to become heroes, and offering them a few words of advice. He urged everyone to listen carefully, telling them that if their dream was to be a hero, they must always be willing to bet their lives and overcome their limits. Everyone was listening intently. The headmaster then threw a punch at the platform he was standing on, shattering it into pieces. Following this display, Headmaster Kallian Badian stated that if they were not prepared for such commitment, they did not belong there. After a series of impressive actions, Headmaster Callion was now scratching his head in embarrassment, wondering aloud if he had been a bit excessive. The students below remained speechless. Earth-shattering screams then echoed from below. Headmaster Callion smiled kindly, stating he couldn't hear them. The two professors standing below him were silently weeping, sharing the same thought. The longer they taught at Lumina, the more the headmaster's dignified image seemed to crumble. After the headmaster's speech concluded, the interlocutor stepped forward and announced that it was time for the speech from the representative of the new recruits. The interlocutor paused for a moment before inviting the representative to speak. Celia and Abad looked up at the stage, as did Chunxia and Chloe. Walden Taiden and Duran Moira were also waiting to see who would be called. The interlocutor read out the name of our protagonist, Leo Plav. At first, Leo looked shocked, then he glanced at Professor Albi. The interlocutor invited him to the stage. Seeing Professor Albi smiling at him, Leo finally understood that the professor had nominated him. He walked towards the stage and took the speech papers. Stepping in front of the entire student body, Leo began to read slowly and confidently from the first line, addressing all the professors and seniors. The students below were murmuring amongst themselves, commenting that the representative wasn't one of the top scorers and that they had never heard of Leo Plav. Among them, Duran Moira remained silent. Leo read that the new recruits would now join the ranks of the proud members of Lumina. Walden Taiden frowned uncomfortably, thinking about Leo's gaze and attitude. After reading, Leo closed the speech papers and introduced himself as the representative of the new recruits, Leo Plav, thanking everyone. The interlocutor thanked Leo and then asked him to state his goal as the representative of the new recruits. Leo smiled. With this smile, he understood something. They wanted him to provoke those who were almost eligible for his position instead of him. But Leo decided to do as they wanted. He introduced himself again as Leo Plav, the representative of the new recruits. Behind them, two professors were discussing the situation, noting that the representative was handling it well and that a model student wasn't a bad choice. The other professor replied that it seemed it would be a peaceful entrance ceremony. Leo, with his hands in his pockets, looked confident and stated that if anyone wanted his position, they should come and take it. Below, Abad smirked, and Celia looked surprised. Chunxia was stunned, while Chloe remained indifferent. This time, both Walden Taiden and Duran Moira showed signs of dissatisfaction and anger. Leo, still on the stage, continued his provocative words towards anyone who might challenge him. That afternoon, at the Lumene Academy dormitory, someone offered praise, saying Leo had done well that day. The professor who had led the students to the dormitory announced that starting the next day, exploratory classes would begin for 1 week. He explained that during this period, students could choose any class they desired, regardless of their intended major. Through this process, they would select the 3 main areas they wished to study. He concluded by instructing them to return to their rooms and rest early to avoid being late for the first class. After he finished speaking, the students went to find their rooms. Leo's room was number 302, and Car's room was 303. Car looked around and commented that their rooms were right next to each other. He opened his room and looked at Leo, expressing his excitement for the next day and wishing Leo a good rest. Leo smiled and replied in agreement, saying he would see him tomorrow. In his room, Leo flopped onto his bed. He placed his hands behind his head and thought about what he truly wanted at Lumina, the library, the place where the history of heroes was stored. That was his ultimate goal. He wanted to learn about his past self and hoped to find a record of his heroism, something he believed was there. The next morning, in the Academy's dining hall, students were eating breakfast. Leo was calmly eating his meal when Car approached with a stack of bread and milk, greeting him and asking if he could eat with him. Leo, putting a piece of meat in his mouth, replied without turning his head that it was fine. But just as everything seemed peaceful, a disdainful voice rang out, directed at the representative of the new recruits. The person heavily placed their bowl of food on the table. Leo, with an air of indifference, looked up and inquired who it was. The person on the other side was none other than Duran Moira, the leader of the Central Region. He looked at Leo with a displeased expression, asking what Leo had meant by his words in the speech the previous day. Leo, still calmly chewing his food, replied that perhaps his words had been a bit provocative, suggesting that it would likely be true if a stranger came and provoked someone like that. Duran Moira's eyes were filled with envy and resentment as he asked if Leo did not know who he was, identifying himself as the leader of the Central Region. But as soon as he said this, no one seemed to pay much attention. Both Leo and Car were ignoring him, finding the food too delicious. Duran Moira's anger flared up again, and sparks of energy surrounded him. Car was horrified at the scene. Duran Moira angrily kicked the dining table, sending the food of both Leo and Car flying into the air. Leo quickly jumped from his seat. In his hand, he held a plate, catching his flying food. He then quickly grabbed his tray and carefully placed his food back on it, neatly arranging it. Below, Carr was deeply moved, tears welling up in his eyes because Leo had saved his precious tray of food. When Leo set the tray down, a perfectly assembled burger had appeared. He declared it a burger with the best ingredients, the double cheeseburger king. In front of Duran Moira's dark and angry face, Leo still showed no anger. He looked at Duran Moira provocatively and stated that it was unforgivable to waste such precious food. Taunted, Duran ground his teeth and replied that he would immediately pull Leo down from that position. He roared angrily in the academy dining hall, unable to stand seeing someone he perceived as weaker acting so arrogant. Just as he was about to attack Leo, Professor Ein placed his hand on Duran's and Leo's shoulders. Behind Professor Ein, a threatening aura emanated as he spoke. Professor Ein, expressionless, stated that one of them was the leader of the central region and the other was the representative of the first-year students. Duran looked tense while Leo remained calm, but both had the same thought at that moment. They wondered when Professor Ein had arrived. Professor Ein glanced at the two of them and sternly addressed them about fighting on the first day at Lumene. At this moment, sensing an aura of hostility surrounding them and with a few drops of water from melting ice landing on their faces, Professor Ein said coldly that they must be ready. After breakfast at the exploratory night class, Professor Ein was standing with his arms crossed, waiting for his students. A student politely asked the professor if it was almost time for class to start. Nearby, Celia was looking around, wondering why Leo wasn't there yet. Just as she finished her thought, a commotion sounded outside. Both Leo and Duran Moira came into the classroom, panting. Celia quickly ran up to ask Leo what had happened and if he had fought. But Leo's gaze was fixed on Duran Moira, who was angrily entering the classroom. Leo was covered in sweat and grumbled something under his breath, though his words were unclear. After the two entered the classroom, Professor Ein said that everyone was present and suggested they begin class. He smiled at his students and continued, greeting the new students and introducing himself as Professor Ein Alandu, the instructor in charge of the first-year night course. Below, Leo and Duran were secretly glaring at each other, but it seemed that only Duran was still very upset about what had occurred earlier. Carr looked at the scene and thought helplessly about whether a psychological battle had already begun. Professor Ein stepped forward and posed a question about the three powers that originate from mana. He walked around the classroom explaining that these were magical energy, soul energy, and aura. Among them, he noted that aura was the most difficult to control and asked if anyone knew why. As he asked this question, Professor Ein's eyes turned towards Celia. She immediately responded that aura loses the flexibility of mana during the transformation process. Hearing her answer, Professor Ein confirmed she was correct. He began to explain that inside a person, while magical energy and soul energy use mana in its natural state, aura absorbs mana and processes it to better suit the body. A surge of energy emerged from the palm of Professor Ein's hand. He then asked if anyone could explain how they used aura. Energy from ice surrounded Professor Ein, and he asked if it was stored inside the body, answering his own question negatively. Below, Celia also tried to move the power in her hand, thinking that it wasn't just released after using some power. At the same time, Leo in the back row spoke up, stating that they utilized the power of aura by burning mana. Professor Ein seemed very surprised that Leo was able to answer this question and said admiringly that he was correct. He then asked if Leo knew what was the most important thing when burning mana. This time, Leo looked at Duran Moira, who was still panting, and replied that it was vitality. Professor Ein looked at Leo and stated that he was impressive, asking if Leo Plav had studied aura before. Leo replied honestly that he had not. Professor Ein was even more satisfied with Leo. He smiled to himself, thinking that he had never expected someone who had never properly studied aura would be able to grasp its essence. Having thought this, he said to the students that they should put the theory aside for now. As if matching his words with action, Professor Ein moved his body and suggested they warm up a bit. The students had an opportunity to observe the admirable Professor Ein showcasing his abilities. They watched as Professor Ein effortlessly created ethereal steps to ascend into the air. From his elevated position, he informed the students that the technique was called light steps, explaining that its fundamental principle involved focusing one's aura onto their feet. Professor Ein then landed softly and added that the technique possessed even further applications. A look of deep understanding and perhaps a touch of arrogance crossed Professor Ein's face as he described the limitless potential of its use. After his explanation, Professor Ein allowed the students to begin practicing the technique themselves. Some students managed to lift slightly into the air, but their legs appeared shaky and unstable. Elsewhere, pairs of students were engaged in practice sessions using weapons provided by the academy. Meanwhile, Celia displayed considerable skill in manipulating her aura. She landed gracefully and safely behind Leo, confidently stating that she would teach him if he agreed to call her Big Sis. However, Leo proved equally confident and was not easily swayed, responding coolly that he had no need of her instruction, as the operational principles of aura were not vastly different. Nearby, Duran Moira continued to glare at Leo with lingering resentment, his eyes clearly showing his unwillingness to accept something. Professor Ein observed this entire interaction. Duran Moira appeared quite tense, even biting his finger, an action that brought a smile to Professor Ein's face. Immediately afterward, Professor Ein clapped his hands together to capture the students' attention. He announced that, as they knew, there had been some disarray earlier that morning. Chelsea, confused, wondered aloud what he was referring to, while Carr nearby whispered that he had told her so, implying he knew what was coming. Drawn in by this exchange, Chelsea inquired about what had happened. Above them, Professor Ein called out sternly, requesting Duran and Leo to approach him. The two students quickly moved toward Professor Ein. Professor Ein lowered his head slightly and questioned Duran Moira about the source of his anger. Duran turned his head away, avoiding the professor's sharp gaze, and insisted that he was not angry. Professor Ein raised his head and stated that they would address that matter later. Then, Professor Ein made a significant request. The leader of the Central Region, Duran Moira, and the representative of the new students, Leo Plav, would compete in a one-on-one race for the position of class representative. Professor Ein looked at the two students with a serious expression, specifying that in this match, they were permitted to use aura without any limitations. Hearing this, Duran looked quite shocked, realizing that a lesson was about to be combined with a competition. On the sidelines, the merchant Carr Thomas produced a sign from seemingly nowhere and hung it around his neck, inviting onlookers to place their bets. He spoke, perhaps to himself or those nearby, about the seriousness of the upcoming match. His sign described Duran Moira as the genius of the Moira family and the descendant of a hero, a master of thunder aura, featuring a serious and resentful image of Duran's face below. Carr Thomas continued his impromptu introduction, contrasting Duran with the dark horse from the outskirts and the mysterious individual who had suppressed the leaders of every region to become the representative of the new recruits, Leo Plav. On that side, Leo had already crouched down into his starting position, preparing for the race. Whispers began circulating among the students. Some felt that since he was the representative of the new recruits, Leo ought to display some remarkable skill, noting that from what they had seen earlier when he spoke with Celia Zardinger, it seemed he couldn't even use light steps. Another student agreed, mentioning something he had reportedly done the previous day and expressing his strong dislike for Leo. More dissatisfied comments arose, asserting that not just anyone could be the leader of the Central Region, and pointing out that the new recruit representative had not yet proven anything worthwhile. Breaking the growing tension, Professor Ein spoke, declaring that the first one to reach the finish line would win. He emphasized that whoever won must accept the result, calling it sportsmanship, and addressed both Leo and Duran seriously. Celia privately thought that Leo could not possibly win. She observed Duran Moira, who was radiating energy with sparks of aura crackling around him, and then looked at Leo, who appeared to have no aura visible around him. However, she also recalled that Leo consistently exceeded everyone's expectations. Professor Ein then shouted start, and both Leo and Duran simultaneously set off towards the finish line. From his starting position, Duran had turned his head slightly and confidently told Leo that he would be the best newbie. As soon as those words were uttered, both Leo and Duran pushed off the ground and commenced their race. That's a wrap. The story continues in my next video. Like and subscribe to stay notified.